Hey, y'all, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our corner of the internet for this edition of the Colonizers World Tour, where we are stopping in Italy, which may surprise you, but not only because it was a colonizer, but you're like, it was colonized? Oh, friend, it has been so many things. You're going to learn so much during this time, but I will confess to you, this is the first time in Colonizers World Tour history in which Dr. Erin is the expert on the country. And I know, like, gelato, and I've been there. So, Erin, take it away.
I mean, like, we always do this what did we know about Italy before research. And for those of you that maybe just join us or don't know this, my undergraduate major was in Italian Renaissance art history, and I took 4 years of the Italian language. So I've been to Italy before I did any of that. Ironically, that kind of going to Italy spurred my love of it. But I don't know a lot about like a lot of contemporary Italy. I mean, we learned about history in Italian class, in Italian language class. We learned about contemporary Italy, like ish. But my like area of focus is really like 1450 to 1550. I've got it solid. And it's more art history than like history. So I actually learned a lot, which was exciting. But I've ever since I visited Italy, I have a love for the music and the culture and the language and the art and the film. So I was very excited to have this opportunity to talk about a place that I love and explore it a little bit more. Boy, did we learn a lot.
Yeah, I have been twice to several countries because cruises, to several parts of Italy, I should say, because cruises. And then I also spent the night in the Milan airport once because of a flight delay on my way to Greece. And the best pizza in the world is in Naples. And I've gotten to go to Pompeii, which is incredible. Like, all that. It did not spark a love of the country for me the way that it sparked a love for Dr. Erin. And so my relationship with Italy is much more with Italian Americans growing up in the Northeast. So I just assume that a lot of Italians feel really strongly about sauce because lots of Italian Americans have very strong feelings about if you call it sauce, if you call it gravy, how you make it, whatever. But I thought it was really interesting that one of the things I learned was why they talk with their hands so much. So we'll get into that. That might be my secondary Jeopardy fun fact. But despite it being one of those countries that like we think of as something we all know, I learned an absolute ton. And I realized, especially I started reading the history books that I borrowed in the chapter that said modern Italy. And I was like, I don't know any of this. Napoleon was there?
Yeah.
What? There was Italy between Rome and when I went there? Okay.
What happened? Who knew?
All right, pals. So let's go to the map. You know where this one is. It's the foot kicking the two deflated soccer balls in the middle of the Mediterranean. It is northeast of Tunisia and pretty, northeast of Libya too, connecting to why Mussolini was so into Tunisia. There's two microstates within it of Vatican and San Marino. And I have not been to San Marino, but I have been to the Vatican, and the Vatican Guard uniforms are hysterical. There are 61 million people in Italy, and the major cities are Rome, Milan, Naples, Turin, Bergamo, and Palermo. The official language is Italian, but there is a whole section where it's mostly German-speaking, a whole other section where it's mostly French-speaking, and an entirely other section where it's mostly Slovenian-speaking.
Yep.
Okay, sure. It appears to be pretty homogeneous, where like everybody identifies as Italian, but we will discover what does that even mean and who has any idea. Also, we should say here in the ethnicity that all the data says everybody identifies mostly Italian should communicate to you how they feel about migrants, because they have a massive migration influx from Northern Europe and the Middle East, and yet all the census data still tells us they're Italian. So think about that. The currency is the euro, which, as we talk today in May of 2022, the euro and the dollar are fairly interchangeable. That goes up and down a little bit. The euro is usually stronger than the dollar, but right now we're pretty even. The system of government is a parliamentary republic. They took a long time to get there. Fun fact, Italy wasn't really a country until 1871. Who knew? Not this girl. There are 15 regions and 5 autonomous regions. And as of February of 2021, 35 seats in parliament are held by women. So that is significantly more than the United States. Good job, Italy. Religion-wise, I mean, y'all, they're Catholic. Like, come on now. Like, there's Catholic. Stereotypes are real for a reason. There is a growing Muslim population because of the migration from the various countries. But I would not say it is dominant. And from the maps I looked at, it's mostly in the very southern parts, and Sicily is kind of where Islam is starting to grow. And then, of course, in Rome, because people go to capitals. Economics? How do I politely say it's a shit show? I had no, okay, so I knew that they had to get a bailout from the recession. And then I knew that when COVID hit and they were like one of the hardest hits because of their aging population, there was lots of conversation about how they don't really have an economy. But I just let that pass me by. Didn't really investigate it. So it's the third largest economy in the Eurozone, but the public debt is 131% of the gross domestic product. I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Okay. Industrial North, agrarian South. The industrial North is nothing is dominant. Like, there's no, like, everyone knows Detroit's made for cars. Like, there's not really any of that in northern Italy. I mean, they make wine, and fashion, and there's not a lot. There is massive youth unemployment. Around 30% of people 16 to 24 are classified as unemployed. What? Especially school ends at 16. So, like, that's a thing. Like, it's not like they're going to school and that's why they don't work. Yikes on bikes. They have near universal literacy and not universal employment. So the times they are rough over there. And I think it's important. This is where I should just say there are massive cultural fractures within Italy in a way that reminds me, like Aaron and I joked offline, like they should have never been a country. There was just like 3 people that decided they should be a country, and that's why they're a country, kind of like Somalia. And a little bit of like how fractured, we talk about Northern Ireland. I'm shocked we don't talk about Italy in the same way, because the cultural fractions between the city-states, between the North and the South, between all of that really does prevent them from getting things done, because none of them can agree on what it means to be Italian. One of the things that I read in a book that I want to quote here before we move on to demographics and colonization, because I think this will help. It helps me understand. Italy has struggled since its inception as a nation state in developing and broadcasting, both domestically and externally, a convincing story of what it means to be Italian and exactly what Italy stands for. No wonder 131% of their gross domestic product. Okay, Italy.
Yikes on bikes. Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting too, because similarly to Ireland, there is a mass immigration of Italians to other parts, but to the United States as well. And the Italian-American identity, I think, has shaped and misshaped a lot of perceptions of what it is to be Italian.
Yeah.
And so a lot of Americans would assume being Italian is like the Italian Americans that they know, which is a severe reduction of what, like, the breadth of cultural diversity that exists within Italy. And like, you know, we watched a couple of videos that are in the downstairs in our Google Doc, even just about like the differences in language. Like, it is a big country geographically, but like, depending on where you are, you have different words for things. It's all in Italian, but like Sicilian Italian and Tuscan Italian and Roman Italian are all different in ways. So it's interesting to me to think about like the cultural development of the idea of what it means to be Italian, and where that comes from. And so much of it is influenced from the diaspora and then from like The Godfather, I think, in a way that is both accurate and not accurate. But speaking of things that are accurate, we'll jump into demographics. Life expectancy is high in Italy. It's at 82%. The contraceptive prevalence rate is 65%. And there's 1.22 children born per woman. And there's a fascinating piece, I think, from PBS NewsHour that's in our Google Doc about the falling birth rates and how that's a real problem for Italy because they have a very old population. And like women used to have 6 babies in the 1960s and now they're having 1, maybe 2. And it's because a lot of people feel that conditions aren't good enough to support larger families, especially since they've never really recovered from the 2008 recession. There's a lot of stagnation that's left over from that recession. And so a lot of Italians, if they are staying in Italy, don't want to have a lot of kids. And a lot of them are migrating elsewhere to look for work. It is second in the world only to Japan for having the highest number of senior citizens. So it's not a great population to have a severely dropping birth rate because like who's going to look after them? It's 20%, 20% of the population is below the poverty line. And 1 million of those folks were added because of the pandemic.
Wow.
So yeah, 1 million folks. And I don't know, like the video that I watched on that was from 2021. I don't know if that's, I would imagine, rebounded a little bit as economies have opened up and the pandemic has transitioned towards more endemic stages. We certainly heard about Italy a lot at the start of the pandemic in terms of the impact that that COVID was having there. We haven't had a lot of discussions about it since. But yeah, for me, that was massive. So, you know, that's a lot of people under the poverty line. That's a lot of people unemployed. And that begs a lot of questions about what other situations look like in the country. So jumping into human rights, for LGBTQ folks, it's interesting because Italy on the surface seems like one of the more progressive EU states. They have marriage equality from 2016, and some regions have adopted, some of those regions have adopted adoption rights or included adoption rights as a part of that. There's protection against employment discrimination, but not like ubiquitous protection against discrimination.
Okay.
And so they lag behind a lot of other EU states in terms of anti-homophobia measures. And very recently they had an anti-homophobia, anti-misogyny, bill that was did not pass the Italian Senate. And it was set to provide like real strong measures against homophobic incidents. There's been a number of attacks on people in recent times. So, and that's because 55% of Italians accept queer folks, which is well below the EU average. That's not a very high acceptance rate.
No.
Meaningful debate and any progress are usually stymied by the very macho culture, Catholicism, and the growing support for far-right parties, which is a big deal in Italy right now. For women, I learned something not shocking for a very Catholic country, but shocking to me anyway. You can only have an abortion between 3 and 6 months in your pregnancy, and only if the woman's physical and psychological health is at risk. There is nothing codified in law about the health and well-being of the fetus.
Okay.
There's a video in the Google Doc that's about fetus graveyards where they bury aborted fetuses without the knowledge of the mothers and the families. So that's a whole story that I learned about. But access to abortion continues to be obstructed because there's actually a high number of doctors and healthcare providers that refuse to provide the care. Levels of violence against women and girls, male violence against women and girls remains high. just like everywhere else in the pandemic, intimate partner violence and domestic violence skyrocketed because people were at home. So recently the Senate voted down that bill that would have made violence against LGBT people and disabled people, as well as misogyny, a hate crime. So that did not pass, which gives you a sense for kind of
where they are. Yeah.
Where they are about that. Where they are about migrants is also not great. They have a huge migrant and refugee problem. At the end of 2021, an estimated 300,000 migrants remained without any documentation in Italy. And there's another couple good stories in the Google Docs about migrant farm workers specifically. Yeah. Most of them immigrate from Africa, and they're just in a real terrible spot. They can't get work visas, and they don't have paperwork, so they can't move up in the economy. There are 80 shanty towns around the whole country that are just populated with migrant farm workers. They make 35 euro per day, and then they have to pay the mafia 10 euro for like the pleasure of working. And it's really exploitative because work contracts are tied to resident permits. And so they can't get one or the other. And so they're stuck in this like limbo. And this situation has really evolved since the first lockdown, because they couldn't go to work because they didn't have paperwork, even though farm workers were deemed essential workers.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So, they were like, we need food, but we don't have any workers because we've created this system in which they can't get legal paperwork. So there's a couple of groups that have banded together to advocate for migrant farm workers specifically. There's even one that I learned about that formed a group called Ghetto Out, and they make their own canned tomatoes now to raise awareness for migrant farm workers, which is awesome. And so in co-ops around Italy, if you're watching this in Italy and you have the financial means to do so, go support Ghetto Out and buy some canned tomatoes. So human rights is a bit of a mess, and so is the history of colonization history of Italy. Obviously, I'm not going to cover the history of Italy. We'd be here for another like 4,000 years. There's lots of conquering. There's the Roman Empire. There's the Etruscans. Like, okay, cool. And then unification. There's a lot of strong regional and ethnic identities, which Kristen mentioned, and that play a huge role in their kind of inability to cohesively work together. So we get the idea, like the concept of Italy starts to come about at the time of the Renaissance, but it really picks up after the Napoleonic Wars, where pretty much people were like, well, I don't want to be French, so what am I? Maybe I'm Italian. And they were really tired of being like conquered by everybody else. So they were like, maybe if we like work together, we won't get like conquered as much. But what that, like, it's interesting in terms of our perspective on colonization. One of the reasons why they weren't longtime colonizers like the Portuguese, like the British, was because even in the 1850s, there wasn't like the idea of Italy in the first place. There was no national project that was compelling them to go conquer other parts of the world.
They didn't really leave until Mussolini needed more soldiers.
Yeah. And Mussolini also wanted to like return to this ideal of like the Roman Empire. Yeah. And so then he was like, we need other places in order to be an empire. So that's fascinating to me. Unification came through a growing push for economic modernization, which isn't surprising either, into the 1860s and 1870s. And like that type of modernization and industrialization requires a broader sense of nationalism, like for infrastructure and like agriculture and steamships and trains and all that
and
jazz.
Like if we could just have one currency, that would really help. Yeah.
So folks who were interested in this idea of Italian nation started a war with Austria in 1859.
As you do.
With the help of the French, because like all those parts like in northern Italy where there's German and French predominantly spoken, or a mixture of both, it's because it was part of the Austrian Empire and part of the French colonizing things. Giuseppe Garibaldi landed in Sicily and kind of conquered Italy for Italy from the south. And the Piedmont Sardinia forces came from the north down and eventually like took over everything. And they're like, we're going to declare Kingdom of Italy in 1861. And just like Kristen said, it's like 3 people were like, now we have a kingdom. You're welcome. And it was united under Victor Emmanuel II, who was ironically, not ironically at all, the leader from Piedmont Sardinia. So he just basically led the colonization of his own country and was like, and now I'm king, yay for me. But we, and then like really nothing happens in Italy, I kid. A lot of things happen in Italy, but nothing really of note until Benito Mussolini established a fascist dictatorship in the 1920s. And that's where we get a lot of this colonial push from Italy, is from Mussolini. So a lot of their history as colonizers dates back to his grand idea of like returning Italy to its past glory. You know, the Democratic Republic replaced the monarchy in 1946, and then they went through a solid period of economic revival. Italy is a charter member of NATO, of the European Economic Community, which then became the EU. And it has been at the forefront of European and economic and political unification. But they have real persistent problems with economic growth, high youth and female unemployment, organized crime, corruption, economic disparities between southern Italy, the more agrarian parts, and the more industrialized north. And what I like to do at the end of these is kind of look at whether the country is grappling with its colonization and its history of colonization. And it's fascinating because Italy isn't, but not for the reasons that you think they aren't. Or that not for the reasons that they say they aren't, we should say. Culturally, they seem to argue for keeping a lot of like the monuments and relics of colonization as a way to teach against those principles. So there's a couple videos in the downstairs that are talking about like the legacy of Mussolini and like all of the architecture from the fascist government that still exists and that people still use. And people were making the argument that like, well, you know, I don't want fascists around anymore, so we kind of need these places to remind us of what that was. But then you had some other Italian historians coming in and saying like, yeah, but we need to do a better job of teaching this because we actually factually have like fascist parties now in Italy again.
We could do it with books too. Like, you know, there's other ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like there's not necessarily like and you know, versions of Italian colonization kind of exist in Libya mostly because that was really close. So there's a lot of remnants of specifically fascist architecture and all that kind of stuff. But they don't have as much of an imprint in public spaces in the other places that they colonized. And there wasn't really a population in Italy that was subjugated besides the Italians, like under Mussolini.
Right.
So there's not a push for a subjugated or an oppressed group like there is here in the United States, where you've got lots of black folks and lots of allies of black folks that are like, we don't need these Confederate monuments. So they have a little bit of a different conversation about it. But they also argue that they're used to layers of history. That was one of the arguments that was made.
Interesting. Okay.
So we're used to history being complicated and having a lot of layers, and like we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, which was an interesting argument, I thought. As I said, fascism is growing again in Italy. There's a political party called Casa Pound that is especially tapping into working class Italian frustration over immigrant and migration issues, stagnating economy, all of the reasons we see people moving towards far-right groups around the world. Their primary political concerns are jobs and immigrants, but they're also quasi-socialist in that they go into these communities and set up food banks and provide healthcare and all of this kind of stuff. So they're trying to show that the state isn't working, and that they will make the state work. And so it's a version of extreme nationalism that we're seeing in Poland and France. Romania and France and the United States, all these places. So that's where Italy stands now, as both a colonizer and a colonized by like every civilization in the history of Western Europe. So it's a fascinating place to spend some time, and we hope you've enjoyed it. Dr. Kristen, we both struggled to pick one Jeopardy fun fact. I know you wrote down like 4 in our notes. What are you landing on?
I'll do 4 rapid fire. Is that...
Go.
Okay.
Go.
So one...
You can do as many as you want.
The William Tell Overture was written by an Italian. Absolutely would have believed it was an Englishman. So, okay. Pinocchio was written as a guide to teach children how to be a proper Italian child. If you have not watched Pinocchio recently... or gone on the ride in Disneyland, as I did a couple months ago, and went, wow, is this a morality tale? Revisit Pinocchio, and you will not be surprised by this.
Yeah, it's state propaganda.
It's intense. There is a sport only played in Florence that is called Calico Storico, which is football and MMA and chaos all together in Florence. Videos in the downstairs. And finally, the reason that they all talk with their hands is because of those linguistic differences that Erin mentioned earlier. That stereotype comes from a real thing where, because they didn't have the words that meant with each other, they came up with symbols that did. And so that's where the stereotype comes from. I do not know where the stereotype for like quick tempers comes from, because that's one of the other things that the diaspora has. But I think that has something to do with it being really hot a lot, and people get cranky when it's hot. Because Southern Italy gets hella hot. And yeah, northern is mountains. Southern is not. So.
It's a lot of hills and a lot of sandstone. It's very warm. Mm-hmm. Even when I was in Umbria, which is more towards the north than the south, it was very warm.
I think the farthest north I've been, because I didn't actually leave the airport in Milan, I was in Florence, and I remember Florence being pleasant.
Florence. Yeah, Tuscany is very temperate. Then you get.
I wanted to like scrape myself off the sidewalk in Rome, like. Yeah. I was not a happy Kristen. I could also talk about the dead Pope in a box, but I think instead I'll turn it over to you, because you have 2 that I think are very worth bringing up.
Yeah. Shocking no one, the art historian chose 2 things about art history. But they're things that were buried deep in the recess of my undergraduate learnings that, like, once they uncovered, I was like, this is a fascinating conversation about humans and what we do. So the first one is that all of those lovely marble statues that you see all over Rome and Florence, you've got Michelangelo's David, you've got the Winged Victory, you've got the very famous statue of Julius Caesar at the Vatican museums. All of Pietà. The Pietà, Michelangelo's Pietà. So all of those that were from ancient Rome, not the Pietà, not Michelangelo's David, because they were Renaissance time, but all of the ones from ancient Rome were painted. They were very colorful. All of ancient Rome and the Roman Empire was very colorful. Painted walls. We know a lot of this from Pompeii.
Yep.
So when they discovered the ruins at Pompeii, they were like, oh crap, these things were painted. But we didn't know that in the Renaissance, and neither did the Renaissance artists. And so they just made them out of marble, and they didn't paint them. And now forever altered is our idea of what Roman statues and sculptures should look like. And all of the replicas and all of the Renaissance classical style sculpture that still happens today is not painted. So I thought that was interesting. So you can blame Michelangelo in part for that. Lol. He didn't know any better, everybody. We didn't find Pompeii till much, much later.
Can I tell you my favorite thing about Pompeii? Is that
Please.
one of the best preserved rooms of the paint, like that have all the painting and all the colors, is the brothel.
Yes.
With like well-detailed drawings of the various services offered.
Yeah.
If you don't know that about Pompeii, you're welcome. It's a fascinating tour. Fascinating.
I imagine that it is, yeah. The second Jeopardy fun fact I would like to talk about is tell the little story of a tiny painting everyone knows called the Mona Lisa. Its actual name in Italian is La Gioconda, which is like the woman who smiles. It's painted by Leonardo da Vinci. It's arguably the most famous painting in the world.
And one of the most boring, but that's just me.
No, it's boring. One of my gifts to you is liberating you from the pressure of actually having to like art because it's famous.
Honestly, she gave it to me. Let her give it to you.
You don't have to like it. If you don't like it, you don't like it. Just because somebody tells you it's famous and it's important, who cares? If you don't like it, you don't like it. But I learned that 80% of visitors to the Louvre are only there to see the Mona Lisa. It's one of the largest museum collections in the world. You know, the French were really good colonizers. One of the most visited museums in the world. 80% of the visitors are only there to see the Mona Lisa.
That is about this big.
It's not very big.
Like to me, in my mind, it's like an 11 by 14. I know it's a little bit bigger than that, but like
it's a little bit bigger.
When I walked in, I was like, "Are you joking?"
And it's one of those things I love having these conversations because when I was studying art, when I was studying art way back in the day, we used like slide projectors. I'm sure they still do now. It's just like technical, but you project it onto the wall so that you can see the detail of the painting, and it's massive. And so I had one art history professor that was always super emphasizing the actual size of the painting. And sometimes she would like scrunch it down so that we could see, so that we like understood like what it looks like in the room, what it looked like, you know, why it was a lot of times the space that the art is in is almost as significant as the art itself, and how it takes up that space and what else is happening in that space. So that's always really important to remember, the actual size of it. But yeah, then I found a video, it's in the downstairs, that's all about how she became the most famous painting in the world. And she had a famous description from a Victorian Times, the Victorian Times, where this guy, I don't remember his name, wrote like this super glowing review of the Mona Lisa at a time when people couldn't see it. Like you couldn't just travel as easily, which is an important thing to remember. And we have that a lot. Like the reason really Raphael and Michelangelo are famous is because of a man named Giorgio Vasari, who wrote a biography of the lives of Renaissance artists. And he embellished a lot of stories about them. He made up stories about these famous artists, but it became, at the time when we started printing things quite regularly, a very easy to read, easily accessible, widely accessible book. Two volumes. And so like a lot of the things that we think we know about Raphael and Michelangelo and Leonardo, we know from Giorgio Vasari, and they both are and aren't accurate. So very similar thing happened to the Mona Lisa. And then nothing is quite as famous until it's stolen and disappears, because everybody loves an art heist. And she wasn't the most famous portrait in the world until she was stolen in 1911. There were actually, and we had print media at the time, we had newspapers. So the story was in the newspapers. People visited the empty hook where she was. Yeah, it's a crazy, for 2 years. And so it created this whole mythology of like the Mona Lisa and why she was so enigmatic and why this dude stole her and where she ended up and all of this stuff. And so now, like, none of these, I guarantee you, like 79.9% of these 80% like 80% of visitors don't know why she's famous.
I didn't. I was just told to go see her.
You're just told that she is and that you have to go see her. And objectively, it's not a great painting.
No, I don't think dull. Like, the colors are dull.
I don't think it's Leonardo's best painting.
No, I mean, me personally, I will always love Starry Night. I'll just always.
Starry Night is Van Gogh.
That's not what I meant. Sorry.
Oh,
the one.
okay.
No, it's the one. Oh, God. Leonardo's. Anyway, I can't remember. It's not Starry Night, but it involves the sky, and that's what I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, so, like, the why things become famous is a hilarious question and a discussion that I wanted to have, especially about Italy, because that was one of my fascinations in studying it, was why it is held up to still today as like the pinnacle of art and culture and society and history and politics. And a lot of it is, biases that we have, misconceptions that we have. A lot of it is a white colonial mindset that prioritizes Western systems of government. Like, it all ties together in this Colonizers World Tour. And it all wraps up with Italy just being a real kooky place.
Yeah, I read that in the 1960s there was, like, they kind of created they created what was known as modern in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And so, like, that's when they exported the design more than anything, the modern design. And a lot of it was classic, like, harkened back.
Yeah, neoclassical, yeah.
To stuff. And that just resonated with people. And then their industry was going pretty well. They were the 5th most industrialized country in the world by the time we hit the 80s. And then when everyone started going to China instead because it was cheaper, they crashed. And for 20 years, their GDP only grew by 1%.
Ooh,
And one of the problems was that all the big fashion houses were being bought by global investment firms. So, like, Versace was still massive and global, but that money wasn't going to Italian people anymore. And so everyone thought Italy was still doing okay around the world because they had wine and Versace, but they weren't. They didn't have any economy. And tourism wasn't huge until the, like, really, like, it wasn't affordable for most people until, like, the 90s and the aughts.
Yeah. And so you think about kind of this economic stagnation that we've talked about, right? And then to understand the impact of a COVID pandemic on the Italian economy. Like, it's very similar to Ireland is doing better economically and has done better.
And it's tinier, which helps.
It is, but tourism is its biggest industry. Tourism is Italy's biggest industry, and Italy doesn't really have much else to keep it going on the level that it needs to be going to maintain its population. So, all of that to say, you can imagine the impact that shutting all of that down for so long had. And we have Italian elections, I think, coming up this year.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, God, we didn't even talk about Berlusconi. Oh my gosh, we didn't even get to him.
I know, like, we didn't even mention him. We're 38 minutes into this, and we didn't even mention Silvio Berlusconi. But, like, just file that under when I said they have problems with corruption.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and if you're interested about, like, some of the housing and, like, what life looks like in the southern Italy right now, there's a great video in the downstairs about the $1 houses that Italy did in the 2010s. That is worth 10 minutes of your life. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so there's a lot happening in the boot kicking the deflated soccer balls country. We love it. We loved learning about it. But I think we'll pause now lest we continue on to more crazy topics about Italy.
I know, I already found a list of books of Italian novels in translation that I'm going to work my way through. So watch out for Abby Research Reads for more coverage on Italy.
Yeah, we definitely, I fell in love with it. And I know Kristen is fascinated by what she's learned and wants to learn more. So, we'll be talking about Italy going forward. And we are talking about Italy tomorrow. We have a film to discuss that is a classic in Italian cinema, Cinema Paradiso, which was the 1990 winner, for Oscar winner for Best Foreign Language Film. So join us tomorrow for that discussion. It's going to be an interesting one. We both got a lot out of this film and found it frustrating in different ways and similar ways.
Y'all
so it'll be a good
slow.
discussion. Be forewarned, it's a long one. Troppo lunghi in Italiano. It's very long. If you like this conversation, meandering though it was, and you want to hear more from us on the Colonizers World Tour or elsewhere, please do the YouTubey things, like and subscribe, click the bell. If you want to hear from us about non-colonizer things, we have a newsletter digest we would love for you to join. The links for all of those relevant things are in the downstairs. And we will see you next for Cinema Paradiso or wherever else you find us on this corner of the internet.
Bye, everybody.